In the early hours of November 20th, 1970, a formation of American helicopters thundered through the night sky over Laos, flying so low that their rotor wash churned the treetops. Inside, 56 men from the U.S. Army's most elite unit sat in silence, faces painted black, weapons clutched tight, every nerve alive. They were heading for a patch of jungle northwest of Hanoi, a place the CIA called Son Tay Prison Camp. The mission? Rescue dozens of American POWs who'd been rotting in North Vietnamese hands for years. They had trained for this moment for months, rehearsing every doorway, every turn, every burst of gunfire on a full-scale mock-up of the camp back in Florida. They knew every tree, every wall, every gate. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the prisoners were long gone. By 1970, the Vietnam War had become a national ulcer. The Tet Offensive was history, the body count charts had lost all meaning, and Nixon's peace with honor sounded more like leave before it gets worse. Yet one issue cut through all the politics: American prisoners of war. Pilots shot down over the north had been paraded through Hanoi like trophies. Reports of starvation, torture, and isolation leaked home. The Pentagon needed a victory, something clean and heroic in a war defined by mud and mistakes. Intelligence analysts, sifting through aerial photographs, spotted what looked like prisoners at a walled compound 23 miles west of Hanoi. They appeared to be signaling in code, short, deliberate movements that spelled out SAR, the distress abbreviation for search and rescue. It was enough to convince the Joint Chiefs that this was the place. Inside those walls, they believed, sat 70 men waiting for rescue. The plan that emerged was codenamed Operation Ivory Coast. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the most ambitious hostage rescue attempt the U.S. military had ever conceived. The Air Force would handle the flight, the Army would bring the muscle, and the CIA would keep its mouth shut unless things went catastrophically wrong. It would be led by Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, a veteran of World War II's OSS, Korea, and half of the Cold War's dirty corners. Simons was the kind of man who could stare down a hurricane and convince it to change direction. When he told his hand-picked Green Berets that they were going into North Vietnam, every one of them volunteered before he finished the sentence. The concept was beautifully reckless. Fly 23 helicopters, including Lundberg HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giants, across 600 miles of enemy airspace in total darkness, slip through the radar net, land inside the camp, kill everyone who resisted, extract the POWs, and vanish before the North Vietnamese knew what hit them. As military plans go, it was both brilliant and borderline suicidal. In August 1970, the Raiders began training at Eglin Air Force Base under total secrecy. They ran night drills until they could move through the camp blindfolded. Pilots practiced low-level navigation so precise they could skim a tree line at 100 knots without touching a leaf. Even the support crews were compartmentalized. If you didn't need to know, you didn't know. By fall, they were ready. To the men involved, the mission was simple: bring the boys home. To Washington, it was a PR dream wrapped in a military gamble. If successful, it would show America still had teeth. If it failed, well, no one would ever admit it happened. The irony, of course, was that the one thing no one thought to double-check was whether the prisoners were still there. Because months before the first helicopter even left the ground, the North Vietnamese had quietly moved every captive out of Son Tay. Flooding from a nearby river had made the camp unlivable. The intelligence photos were months old. The signals interpreted as SAR, probably just men walking in circles in the yard. But on that November night, none of that mattered. The rotor spun, the fuel burned, and 56 of America's best prepared to charge headlong into history, straight toward a prison full of ghosts. Colonel Arthur Bull Simons wasn't the kind of man who asked permission to start a war. He'd spent 3 decades fighting in the shadows, from the jungles of Burma with Merrill's marauders to covert work in Laos. He didn't care for politicians, paperwork, or the word impossible. When the Pentagon needed someone to lead a raid into the heart of North Vietnam, they didn't call a diplomat, they called Bull. Planning began under layers of secrecy so thick that even the men training for it didn't know where they were going. Only a handful of officers at the Joint Chiefs level saw the full plan. Officially, there was no Operation Ivory Coast. On paper, it was an isolated joint training exercise. In reality, it was a precision strike designed to humiliate North Vietnam, terrify their guards, and snatch American POWs right out from under Uncle Ho's nose. The CIA provided satellite photos and reconnaissance from Lockheed SR-71 Blackbirds flying at the edge of space. The Air Force handled the flight logistics, fuel, timing, and suppression of any radar that so much as twitched. And the Army's 6th Special Forces Group supplied the raiders. Green Berets chosen for experience, toughness, and an uncommon tolerance for suicidal odds. The planning room looked like a marriage between NASA and a biker bar. On one side of the table, men with slide rules and maps measured distances in nautical miles and seconds. On the other, cigar-chewing veterans talked about how many magazines to load for a 15-minute gunfight. Together, they designed something almost beautiful, a plan so clean it could only work once. They called it Ivory Coast because, well, Son Tay didn't sound like a place you'd want to brief the president about. The operation was broken into 3 elements. Blue Boy, the assault team landing inside the prison walls. Greenleaf, the ground support element securing the perimeter. And Redwine, the command and control group managing the chaos. The aircraft would fly in from Udorn, Thailand, over 600 miles one way, skimming the terrain to stay below radar, with tanker support for refueling en route. Timing would be everything. If one chopper fell behind, everyone was dead. To practice, they built a full-scale replica of the Son Tay camp at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. Every hut, fence post, and ditch was placed exactly where it appeared in the recon photos. The raiders rehearsed in darkness using red lights, memorizing every step until they could sprint from the landing zone to the target building in under 2 minutes. They trained to shoot only what needed shooting, every round accounted for, every motion choreographed. Security was so tight that even the cooks on base were ordered not to talk. Anyone caught gossiping about the camp in the woods found themselves reassigned to somewhere that didn't exist. Most of the men's wives thought they were on extended field training. They weren't wrong, just not the way they imagined. Politically, the timing was delicate. Nixon's team wanted to show a force without triggering a full-blown war with China or the Soviets. Kissinger was cautious, Laird was skeptical, but Nixon wanted to win. The news of American POWs suffering in Hanoi was fueling protests back home, and the president needed to show that America still protected its own. The word came down: proceed. The green light set a clock ticking no one could stop. Everything was scheduled to the second. Weather forecasts, lunar phases, radar sweeps, even when the roosters would crow in Son Tay. The raid had to hit at 2 a.m. local time, between guard rotations, when the night was darkest. It would be in and out in less than 30 minutes. There was no backup plan. Pilots from the Air Force 1st Special Operations Wing were handpicked and told they'd be flying deeper into enemy airspace than any American had since 1968. They trained alongside the Green Berets, learning to trust each other's timing and discipline. By the final rehearsals, the formation could take off, fly 600 miles, hit a target the size of a football field, and be gone before the alarm clock went off in Hanoi. To say the men were ready would be an understatement. They were coiled like springs, weeks of pent-up adrenaline waiting for release. When they finally received the go order in November, no one cheered. They just started packing magazines. Operation Ivory Coast had passed from theory to reality. The briefings ended. The mock camp in Florida was torn down. The pilots filed flight plans that didn't exist, and the Green Berets checked their gear one last time. It was a perfect plan, rehearsed to perfection, approved at the highest levels of government. There was just one thing nobody realized yet. All that perfection was aimed squarely at the wrong address. The night of November 20th, 1970 was moonless, hot, and silent. Perfect weather for sneaking 29 aircraft into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. From Udorn Royal Thai Air Base, engines roared to life as pilots and raiders climbed aboard. No one said much. This wasn't the kind of mission you toasted with beer and good lucks. You just tightened your straps and waited for the green light. The formation lifted off shortly after 11 p.m. 6 C-130s, 5 HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giants, 1 smaller HH-3E, and a swarm of A-1 Sky Raiders for fire support. It was a strange ballet of aircraft, each with a precise role and time hack. The C-130s were navigation and refueling birds, laying down flares and acting as flying beacons. The Jolly Greens carried the assault teams. The A-1s, old piston-driven beasts from another era, would chew up any anti-aircraft guns foolish enough to open fire. They flew so low that the rotor blades kicked up dust from rice paddies and sent villagers diving for cover. At 105 knots, just 100 feet off the deck, the formation snaked through mountain valleys, following rivers and terrain contours to stay below radar. A single mistake, one flicker on a North Vietnamese radar screen, could bring down MiGs, SAMs, or worse. The men joked that if they flew any lower, they'd need to bring machetes. Inside the helicopters, the Green Berets sat in the red glow of cargo lights, checking and rechecking their gear. Magazines taped together for fast reloads, flashbangs ready, demolition charges packed in waterproof bags. Simon sat near the door, stone still. No speech, no rallying cry, just a nod. The kind soldiers understand means see you on the other side. As they crossed into North Vietnam, radio silence held, the navigators guided by stopwatch, compass, and sheer faith in their training. Outside it was pitch black. The only light came from the dim glow of instruments and the occasional lightning flash far off in the clouds. Approaching the target, the formation split. One element, Greenleaf, would land outside the camp to block reinforcements. The Blue Boy element, riding in the HH-3E codenamed Banana, would crash land right inside the prison courtyard. Crash wasn't a metaphor. The pilot, Major Richard Dick Meadows, was going to deliberately slam the helicopter into the compound wall, chop the engines, and let momentum carry them inside. It was the only way to guarantee a surprise entry in the confined space. But even the best plans can meet Murphy's Law at terminal velocity. Just before the assault, a navigation error sent one of the helicopters, call sign Cherry 01, off course. They spotted a compound below that looked identical to the one they'd memorized back in Florida. Same wall layout, same guard towers, same lights. Without hesitation, they dropped in. It was the wrong camp. Instead of POWs, they found a full garrison of North Vietnamese troops, an army school for special forces training, less than a mile from the actual Son Tay prison. As the choppers hit the ground, the raiders burst out and opened fire, cutting through the startled defenders with brutal precision. It was over in minutes. Dozens of enemy soldiers lay dead or wounded. The Americans didn't lose a man. Then the radio call came through. Negative, negative, this is not the target. Simons' team in Banan was already inbound to the real camp, oblivious to the mix-up. At 2:18 a.m., they roared over the trees and rammed straight through the wall of Son Tay prison, exactly as rehearsed. The chopper skidded to a halt in the courtyard, blades snapping off against the guard tower. Before the dust settled, Green Berets poured out firing, mowing down stunned guards and clearing buildings room by room. Everything went like clockwork. Except there were no prisoners. They found empty bunks, rusting tin cups, and the faint smell of human absence. Beds made, clothes folded. The camp was clean, quiet, and deserted. Months earlier, the prisoners had been moved north because the nearby river flooded and almost drowned them in their sleep. The raiders had hit a museum exhibit of failure. Perfect tactics, perfect timing, zero results. Outside the walls, the diversionary team was drawing fire from the nearby garrison, the same one that had just been accidentally annihilated by the misplaced assault team. Tracers filled the sky. A-1 Sky Raiders dove in low, strafing anti-aircraft positions with 20mm cannon fire. The jungle erupted in chaos. Simons, calm as ever, ordered the code phrase ladle, 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 a signal to abort. The extraction began immediately. The helicopters lifted off, weaving through gunfire, with North Vietnamese forces scrambling to catch up. Behind them, the camp burned. The entire raid had lasted 27 minutes from first shot to departure. It was textbook execution of a mission built on faulty intelligence. Not one American dead, not one POW rescued. A flawless operation aimed squarely at nothing. They'd just flown through hell, landed inside a hornet's nest, fought their way out, and returned with only the satisfaction of proving they could. But the irony wasn't over yet. because that night's failure would set off a chain reaction that changed the entire POW system and modern special operations forever. When the rotor wash settled and the last echoes of gunfire faded, the Meta Blue Boy team realized something was off. No voices, no shouting, no pounding on the walls from desperate captives. Just the wind whispering through bamboo and the faint hum of the damaged helicopter cooling in the courtyard. Major Dick Meadows led the first sweep through the barracks. Every door was kicked in, every bunk checked. Nothing. Neatly stacked beds, mosquito nets hanging untouched, uniforms folded on empty shelves. It looked like a Boy Scout camp waiting for summer to start. Then came the gut punch. A handwritten calendar on a wall stopped months earlier. The camp had been abandoned since late summer. Meadows keyed his radio. Negative personnel. Repeat, negative personnel. For a few seconds, nobody answered. Nobody wanted to believe it. Colonel Simons, outside the perimeter, heard the call and clenched his jaw. The silence in his voice told everyone what words didn't need to. The prisoners weren't here. Months of planning, months of secrecy, and they'd come all this way to rescue ghosts. Still, they had a job to finish. The raiders switched instantly from rescue to demolition. They cleared the remaining guard towers and structures with ruthless precision, every shot placed, every doorway covered. One team found a single guard still breathing. They dragged him out into the courtyard. Under the glare of flashlights and rifle barrels, the man looked terrified. Simons barked through an interpreter. "Where are the prisoners?" The guard pointed north. "Moved months ago," he said. "Flood came. Camp empty." That was all they needed to hear. Simons ordered the demolition teams to plant charges. If they couldn't take the prisoners out, they'd make damn sure the North Vietnamese couldn't use this place again. Claymores and thermite grenades went off like a symphony of failure. Deliberate, clean, and absolute. Outside the walls, the Greenleaf team was waist deep in chaos. The accidental strike on the nearby military school had woken up half of Santé province. Anti-aircraft guns barked from every direction, sending tracers lancing through the night sky. A-1 Sky Raiders screamed in overhead, strafing and dropping flares to blind the enemy's radar. The sky turned into a flashing storm of red and white. Yet somehow the coordination held. The Raiders' training paid off in spades. Radio discipline was perfect. Extraction zones were cleared and marked in seconds. Men moved with the cold efficiency of professionals who already accepted the risk and were just cashing the check. Simons called the exfil signal, ladle, ladle, ladle. The phrase meant we're leaving, now. Within minutes, helicopters were touching down amid the dust and fire. Raiders piled aboard, covering each other's retreat as flares lit the compound like daylight. From the air, the view was surreal. The Santé camp burned below, surrounded by tracers and the confused panic of a garrison trying to fight shadows. The helicopter formation wove between bursts of anti-aircraft fire, diving low over rivers and tree lines. Pilots pulled every trick they knew to stay alive, dodging 37mm shells that exploded close enough to rattle teeth. One helicopter took damage from ground fire and limped out, leaking hydraulic fluid, but made it to Laos. Every man got out, no Americans killed, one minor injury, a sprained ankle from jumping out too fast. In any other war, that would have been a miracle. Tonight it just felt hollow. Back at Udorn, the helicopters landed to the sound of crickets and the smell of jet fuel. The mission clock read 27 minutes from insertion to extraction. On paper it was perfect. In the hangar, it was silent. Nobody cheered, nobody saluted, just exhausted men climbing off helicopters, covered in sweat and soot, staring into the middle distance as the adrenaline wore off. Simons walked the line, checking faces. He didn't need to say anything. His men knew what they'd done and what they hadn't. The intelligence had failed them, but the execution had been flawless. They had proved that America could reach anywhere, at any time, and hit with surgical precision. They'd just proven it on the wrong target. When the debriefing began, the phrase that stuck came from one of the pilots. "We were 100% successful and 0% effective." It was true. Every step of the plan worked exactly as designed. Every man survived. Every aircraft came home. But the result was nothing. They'd risked everything to rescue no one. Word of the raid reached Washington within hours. At the Pentagon, the reaction was confused. At first, some officers thought the mission had been canceled. Then the reports came in. No casualties, no prisoners. How could that be? One general asked. Because the place was empty, Simons replied flatly. We hit it exactly on time. They just forgot to tell us it was vacant. The press would never know the details until years later, but inside military circles, Operation Ivory Coast was already becoming legend. The planning, coordination, and execution were near flawless, the kind of things staff colleges would study for decades. But even in the middle of that professional pride, the Raiders themselves felt the sting. They hadn't failed, the system had. And yet, paradoxically, their failure accomplished something no one expected. Within days, the North Vietnamese began quietly transferring every remaining American POW to the Central Prison Complex in Hanoi, the notorious Hanoi Hilton. The move, meant to prevent another Son Tay-style raid, had an unintended consequence. For the first time in years, prisoners were consolidated, accounted for, and in some cases, reunited with others they thought dead. Conditions even improved slightly under the watchful eyes of foreign diplomats, now aware of their location. The men who'd been supposed to be rescued would later say they heard the explosions that night. One POW, years after release, recalled seeing the sky glow red and hearing distant gunfire. They didn't know it then, but that was the sound of salvation that missed them by a few months. The Son Tay raid had failed in the only way it could, by succeeding too late. And though the camp was empty, its message was loud and clear. America hadn't forgotten its prisoners, it just needed better directions. When dawn broke over North Vietnam, the Son Tay raid was already the talk of every military outpost, from Hanoi to Haiphong. The North Vietnamese army had spent the night firing at ghosts. By sunrise, the wreckage of Banana, the helicopter that had smashed into the courtyard, was surrounded by stunned soldiers, shell casings, and the unmistakable scent of American audacity. Within hours, they pieced together what had happened. U.S. commandos had flown 600 miles through the world's most sophisticated air defenses, hit a target 23 miles from the capital, killed dozens of guards, and vanished before breakfast. Ho Chi Minh City wasn't outraged. It was terrified. The propaganda ministry scrambled to spin the event as a cowardly attack, but privately, Hanoi's generals were furious at their own intelligence failures. The Americans had penetrated their airspace undetected and made them look helpless. Orders went out immediately. All remaining U.S. prisoners were to be moved to the Central Ho La prison complex, known to its residents and the world as the Hanoi Hilton. That single decision, made in panic, changed the course of captivity for every surviving POW in North Vietnam. Before Son Tay, American prisoners were scattered across dozens of camps, some barely large enough to house a dozen men. Many were held in isolation, malnourished, and completely cut off from each other. After the raid, consolidation meant larger groups, better food, and, for the first time, communication. The North Vietnamese wanted them in one place, easier to guard and, crucially, easier to display to international observers. Ironically, the mission that rescued no one ended up improving the lives of nearly every prisoner left behind. When the helicopters landed back in Thailand, the men of Operation Ivory Coast were still processing what had happened. The adrenaline crash hit hard. Simons gathered them in the hangar for a debrief. No theatrics, no speeches, just facts. They'd done everything right, and the intelligence had been wrong. Gentlemen, he said, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You pulled off one of the finest pieces of soldiering I've ever seen. Word filtered up the chain fast. The Pentagon's initial reaction was disbelief. Some thought the mission had failed because of bad execution. The myth evaporated the moment the after-action reports hit the desk of Admiral Moorer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. His summary was blunt. Flawless operation, flawed intelligence. Even Henry Kissinger, not known for handing out praise, called it a spectacular example of military professionalism. President Nixon was briefed the following morning. He didn't care that the camp was empty. What mattered was that the world had just seen American Special Forces do the impossible. Publicly, the White House spun the raid as a sign of determination, that the United States would go to any length to bring its men home. Privately, Nixon was delighted. That's the kind of headline we need, he told aides. In the press, details trickled out in the following days. Official spokesmen were tight-lipped, but journalists pieced together enough to write about a daring helicopter raid deep in enemy territory. No one mentioned the name Sante, but everyone understood what it meant. The United States still had claws. Families of POWs found hope again. For the first time in years, they saw proof that someone in Washington still cared enough to act. One wife of a captured pilot said later, "Even if they didn't bring him home, they tried. That was enough." Inside the military, Ivory Coast became a master class in joint operations. The coordination between the Air Force, Army Special Forces, and CIA was unlike anything the Pentagon had ever pulled off. Every detail, timing, fuel, planning, target rehearsal, was studied by staff officers for decades afterward. It was the birth of modern special operations, even if no one knew it at the time. But the raid also exposed how broken American intelligence was during the war. The CIA's reliance on aerial photos and prisoner signals without on-the-ground verification had doomed the mission before it started. In the post-mortem, one analyst put it succinctly, "We had the best operators in the world, and we aimed them at a mirage." Congress wanted answers, of course, but because the mission was technically unauthorized under the War Powers Framework, nobody wanted to be the one explaining it on live television. The investigation faded quietly, buried under layers of classified reports. Nixon was about to let bureaucracy ruin his favorite success story. For the men who flew and fought it, the emotions were complicated. Some felt pride, others frustration. They trained to rescue men, not to make headlines. When journalists later asked if they considered the raid a failure, one pilot shrugged. "We went in, we came out, nobody died. If that's failure, I'll take it every time." Colonel Simons, already a legend among Green Berets, became mythic after Sante. He retired a year later, but never lost his sense of unfinished business. "We did everything right," he said in an interview. "We just got there too late." When Delta Force was formed in the late 70s under Colonel Charlie Beckwith, Simons was brought back as an advisor. His fingerprints are still on nearly every American hostage rescue doctrine today. From an operational standpoint, Ivory Coast changed everything. Nighttime insertions, synchronized air-ground coordination, precision low-level navigation, all became standard practice. The raid's lessons directly shaped later missions like Eagle Claw, the failed Iran hostage rescue, Urgent Fury in Grenada, and Just Cause in Panama. Each bore traces of Sante's DNA, both its brilliance and its haunting reminder that perfect plans still depend on perfect intel. For the POWs, the aftermath was bittersweet. Many didn't learn about the raid until years later, after their release in 1973. When they did, it hit hard. "They came for us," one said. "That's all we ever needed to know." Another described seeing flares and hearing explosions the night of November 20th. "We thought maybe it was bombing. Turns out it was the cavalry." In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese learned something too, that American commandos could reach anywhere at any time. The fear of another raid forced them to improve camp defenses and tighten prisoner management, but it also made them cautious. They couldn't risk provoking another Sante. To the world, Operation Ivory Coast was a paradox. It achieved nothing tangible, yet everything symbolic. No prisoners freed, no territory gained, but for the first time in years, America saw competence, courage, and precision instead of confusion and quagmire. It was the war's most successful failure. And for Bull Simons and his men, that was enough. They didn't need medals or parades. They knew what they'd done. They'd flown into the dragon's teeth, done their jobs, and come home alive. The empty cages at Sante weren't their shame. They were proof of a system that finally learned the difference between bravery and bureaucracy. As one raider put it years later, "We weren't rescuing men, we were rescuing the idea that Americans don't quit." In the decades that followed, Operation Ivory Coast lived on in whispers, citations, and training manuals. Officially, it was labeled a limited success. Unofficially, it was worshipped, the kind of story that every new generation of special operators studied, half in awe and half in envy. Bull Simons went home to quiet retirement, the kind that legends usually don't get. He didn't chase interviews or fame. When asked about San Tay, he'd give the same answer every time. The men did their jobs. No grand speech, no self-promotion. Just simple truth. Simons died in 1979, but not before mentoring the first operators of Delta Force, the direct descendants of his raiders. To them, he was the patron saint of getting things done regardless of how suicidal it looked on paper. The men who flew and fought that night carried the experience for the rest of their lives. They had trained for perfection and executed it flawlessly, only to find the universe had rewritten the ending. Yet not one of them ever called it failure. One pilot put it best: "We proved that if you want something badly enough, we can put men and machines anywhere on Earth to get it." This was the real message of San Tay, and the rest of the world heard it loud and clear. Inside the Pentagon, Ivory Coast became required reading for a new kind of warfare. It proved that small, highly trained teams with surgical precision could achieve strategic results that entire divisions couldn't manage. Out of that revelation came the doctrine of special operations. When the Army needed a blueprint for Delta Force, they started with the San Tay raid. When the Air Force built the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, they used the same flight tactics. Every hostage rescue, every counterterrorism op, every black bag mission since has borrowed something from those 27 minutes over North Vietnam. The POWs who survived captivity learned about the raid years later, after their release in Operation Homecoming. For many, it was the emotional rescue that captivity had denied them. They hadn't been forgotten. America had sent its best to bring them home, even if the calendar got in the way. That raid, one former prisoner said, was the moment we realized we still mattered. By the late 1970s, the mythology of San Tay was fully formed, the flawless mission that failed. Every retelling ended the same way: the empty camp, the stunned soldiers, the silent flight back through enemy fire. But to those who were there, it was never about glory or tragedy. It was about professionalism. They'd done everything humanly possible, and they'd done it right. The fact that cages were empty didn't erase the accomplishment. It amplified it. And as time went on, history started to catch up. Analysts realized that the raid shockwave had forced Hanoi to centralize prisoners, improving survival rates and ensuring the world knew where they were. In a twisted way, that meant San Tay did save lives, just not the way anyone planned. Every few years, the raiders would reunite, older, slower, and just as sharp. They'd trade stories about the night they went deeper into enemy territory than anyone had before or since. Someone would inevitably make the same joke: "We went to save 70 men and came back with none. Must have been the Army's best logistical operation ever." The laughter that followed was part pride, part defiance. In the end, the raid's true legacy wasn't measured in prisoners freed, but in principles forged. It proved that intelligence can fail, bureaucracy can stumble, but courage and competence still mattered. It showed that even in a losing war, there were flashes of brilliance worth remembering. If you strip away the politics, the headlines, and the hindsight, San Tay was pure, soldiers doing their job for the right reason. They didn't go for fame or orders. They went because Americans were suffering in cages, and someone had to try. And that's why the story endures, because long after the war ended, long after the last POW came home, the raid still stands as a quiet declaration of intent. If you hold an American, we will come for them, no matter how far, how dangerous, or how late. The San Tay Raiders didn't bring anyone home that night, but they brought something back far more enduring: the promise that America never stops trying. They went in to rescue ghosts and came back as legends. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?